Welcome to the Charlevoix Stories Project, a continuation of Charlevoix oral tradition. My name is David Miles, and today is Wednesday, October 5th, 2016. We are at the Charlevoix Public Library in Charlevoix, Michigan, and I'm going to be talking to Larry Smith, a graduate of Charlevoix High School in 1958, who went on to become the managing editor of Parade magazine. So welcome, Larry, to Charlevoix and the Charlevoix Oral Traditions Project.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to Charlevoix.
You could say we lived the Robert Frost adage of home is a place where when you go there, they have to take you in. We were living in Dearborn, and basically my parents' marriage broke up. My mother became ill, and we came back up here because this was where her family was. And one of her sisters took my sister, and the other sister, Grace Warren, and her husband Harrison, took my mother, my brother, and me onto the farm, which is, as you know, was 7-8 miles south of Charlevoix and is run to this day by his son Douglas. It's one of the most successful dairy farms, certainly in the state, if not wider. And we started out there, and Harrison Warner was the kind of person who taught you how to drive a truck at the age of 9 in a hayfield pulling a hay loader. And if you didn't respond, he would clang the roof of the truck with his pitchfork and scare the daylights out of you if you stalled the truck or something along those lines. And but he was one of those men who would give you things you didn't think you could do, and you'd find out you could do them if you just did it. So I think from him I got a kind of a confidence that I never would have acquired anyplace else. And then coming into Charlevoix, of course, and going to school here, there was the Radigan family, and whom I know you knew them well. And they were a great influence, both in terms of just giving you a sense of the wider world and encouraging what you might call intellectual development. And it was because of my life had been controlled by other forces, I really wanted to control it myself. And I did not want to have to spend my life in a small town. I desperately wanted an education. And I didn't know anything about colleges. I never paid any attention to it. And Mr. Radigan told Michael McCann, Larry should go to the University of Michigan. And McCann duly reported this to me, and I said, oh, well, if Mr. Radigan says it, I guess I better do it. And next thing, I approached Harry Bingham, who was our principal, for a reference. And I'd been in some scrapes in high school, as you know, David. And
You were what they call a rascal back then.
Mr. Bingham said to me, I could recommend you for Western or Eastern or one of those schools, but I could never recommend you for the University of Michigan. Well, I was taken aback, of course, and that fall, it was 1957, Edward O'Neill with his old Plymouth with the hole in the back seat floor, and Susie Dewar and I drove down to Ann Arbor for visits, and you could get interviews in those days. And I was with this admissions officer, and I was telling him these things that had happened to me, and he said, all these years, I still choke up when I talk about this because it was so important. The guy said, you just go home and send your application in and put my name on it and don't worry about a thing. But I did that, and I was accepted. And the next thing, of course, when you're in a place like Charlevoix, you and me, we both know this, you wonder, do I have what it takes to succeed in the wide world? Am I smart enough to get through college? You don't know until you try it.
That's true.
And I went down there, and I had no thoughts of a career, or not a career. I had no thoughts of making a living. I just wanted to study French like Vince, and I wanted to study great books. I just wanted knowledge. And I from the outset, it was apparent that English was the right major for me because that were the things that concerned me.
Well, this love of literature set in when you were in school. I can remember you devoured books as a kid. You went through books. I think you probably read 10 to my 1.
I love you saying that because the Radigans had given me a book by Somerset Maugham, and it was Maugham's assessment of the 10 greatest novels ever written. And I remember trying to read them all. War and Peace was one of them, of course. You know, oh my God. But yes, there was this. We worshipped books. I did. To me, they were the ticket to everything. I mean, in terms of knowledge or learning.
Well, to explain to the viewer about the Radigans, Bill Radigan was a published author himself with both fiction and nonfiction, and Eleanor wrote a lot for magazines, so they were both very accomplished authors.
Absolutely, and also Bill Radigan had worked in the news business in Colorado and Los Angeles during World War II, so that was very much a part of later developments for me as well. But yes, they were both very literary, very educated, and gave wonderful parties. But anyway, so we're in Ann Arbor, and I've never learned to study. And I flunked my 5 weeks exam in French. And I thought, uh-oh, these people are serious. I better get to work. And I lived in a Michigan house in West Quad in Ann Arbor. I know you know where that is, David. And they had an attic study area. And I would go up to that attic study area every night after my meal job and put in whatever time it took to complete whatever the assignments I had, great books, French, and astronomy, and this kind of stuff. And I would stay there till it was all done, and I would come down at maybe 1, 2 in the morning, then get up and go off to school and to class. And the resident advisor was worried about it because he thought I was staying up too late. But I didn't care. I had this single-minded determination, which was given a great boost by Mr. Bingham, to succeed. You know, I was determined I was not going to fail. And that's how we got through that part of things.
And then, of course, you graduated within the 4 years. You graduated class of 1962. But you had met Dorothea in the meantime, I believe, in an elevator in the old Freeze building, and apparently was close to love at first sight. And after a few dates, you became an item, and then you got married.
That's fairly close. And Dorothea was the first woman, I think, to teach freshman German at Michigan, right? She was working on a PhD in German languages and literature. And I began studying German immediately as soon as I met her.
And you found out you had a natural affinity for languages.
Yeah, and so Dorothy and I met and got married, and she was making money, and I was working in the language lab making money. And when we graduated, we had $4,000, and she got pregnant. And instead of thinking about a job, this college professor friend of mine said, "Why don't you chuck it all and go to Europe?" So we chucked it all and went to Europe and spent the $4,000. This was like in June or July, and came back in October and broke with no prospects. I didn't even know what I was going to do for a living. And I don't know how he could have been so cavalier about that whole thing. But anyway, Dorothea said she'd worked on the Michigan Daily, so she knew a little bit about newspapers. And she said, "Well, why don't you go in the newspaper business?"
Did you have any journalism courses prior to this?
Not a one. Not a one. I could have gone to the Daily if I'd known any better, but I didn't have enough sense to do it. So I had no experience whatsoever. But once again, I talked to Mr. Radigan, and he gave me the name of this guy in Denver named Star Yelland, and at KOA was the station. And I went to downtown Detroit and picked up one of these drive-away cars, where they pay you or pay half the cost of transporting a new car from one place to another. And I got this brand new Pontiac. It had like 12 miles on it. And I drove it without stopping to Denver. And I had to stop to sleep along the way, but I wanted to have the car a few days while I went job hunting in Denver. And anyway, I went to the Star Yelling and the KOA, and he said, "How is old Willie Radigan?" And he had nothing for me. He gave me about 3 minutes, and I was stuck. And so I'm wandering around Denver trying to find a job of some kind so I can rescue Dorothea from her parents' home in Detroit. And in the course of doing this, I went into this place called the Colorado Press Association and filled out a form for job seekers. And then I'll say this quickly. Nothing much was happening, so I took a job as a night short order cook in a restaurant and called Dorothea and said, "I got a job, come on." And so she came all the way out there, pregnant now, like 5 months, and she wasn't there a week and a half, and I got fired. I was giving people too many French fries, and I really wasn't a short order cook anyway. So I came home and I said to her, I said, "I got fired." And she said, "Good." She said, "I can't stand the smell of that chicken grease any farther." And so we headed back to Michigan because I was broke and depleted, and I got another rental car, but the closest I could get to Detroit was St. Paul, Minnesota. So we went up to Boulder where Dorothea had a friend, and I disconnected the speedometer. And we went up to look at Estes Park and came back and drove up to Cheyenne. And Cheyenne had this kind of grungy, dirty snow all around, it was early December. And Dorothea looked out the window and said, "Oh, if there's a place I wouldn't want to live, this is it." And we drove out of town to Grand Island, Nebraska. I reconnected the speedometer, and we drove to St. Paul, and they actually came out and checked my mileage. This was important because I had to get $40 back from these guys because we still had to get to Detroit. And we crossed the river to Minneapolis, got a brand new car to Detroit, and got home without incident. And I decided by this time I got to do something to take care of Dorothea. I can't just neglect her. So I went to the car companies and got these job applications for what I would do in the advertising business kind of thing. And we weren't there very long, a couple of weeks at the most. And the phone rang one night, and my mother-in-law said, "It's for you." And nobody knew where I was because I hadn't told anybody. So I pick up the phone. "Hello, Larry Smith." "Yes, sir. This is Bernard Horton. I'm the editor of the Wyoming Eagle in Cheyenne. I understand you're looking for a job." And I said, "Well, yes, sir, I am." I said, "But how did you find me?" He says, "Well, I had this release here from the Colorado Press Association. It says you've got a degree from the University of Michigan and that you read, write, and speak English. Is that correct?" I said, "Yes, sir, it is." He says, "Well, the job's opening up in 3 weeks. It pays $70 a week." And I said, "When do you want me?" And no, I said, "I'll take it." He said, "You will?" I said, yeah. "And when do you want me?" And he said, "Well, I got a couple of things to do. I'll call you back tomorrow night." He calls back the next night, same time, same station, and says, "I've reviewed your application with our publisher, Robert McCracken, and the most we can offer you for this position is $65 a week." And I said, "I'll still take it." He said, "You will?" I said, "Yes, sir. When do you want me?" And again, we went through the same rigmarole with the rental, the car drive-away thing. But I had a space of about 10 days before I needed to go out there. And one of the things that has most amazed me in my life, as I think about it, is Dorothea's courage. Because here I was preparing to go 1,000 miles away from her parents, everything she knew, no money, no car, no prospects, no nothing, just a job paying $65 a week when I was used to making over $120 a week as a busboy in restaurants. And I thought, is this nuts or what? And Dorothea never said a word, not a word. And I finally, in desperation, I cold called the Detroit Free Press and asked to speak to a reporter. And I said, is this a smart thing to do, or am I crazy? And he said, well, it'll be kind of tough. Once you get there, you know, it'll be some hardship, but you'll get a lot of experience doing different things, and it'll give you a good base, you know, to move on. So I said, okay, thank you very much. And away I went. And she joined me January 1st, and we were in Cheyenne 20 months. Both our girls were born there. Dorothea got some extra classes at the University of Wyoming and taught German for 2 semesters before we moved on to California and another job out west.
So trace now back to New York and just give us a brief summary of what happened up to your night editorship at the New York Times.
All the time I was working these jobs, as I mentioned to you earlier, I was trying to write novels. And I had a friend a mentor who would read the stuff for me. And I finished this novel in Cheyenne, and we went on to California, and I did half of a novel in California, which was awful. And I got hired, and then I wanted to come back east because I knew that's where the publishing center of the country was. So I found a job back there, and we moved back there. And again, I was with this newspaper in Westchester for 4 years, which is how long it took me to write the original.
Westchester being just north of New York City.
Westchester, just north of New York City. The newspaper there was called the White Plains Reporter-Dispatch, and then the Tarrytown Daily News. And from there, as you know, I went to the New York Daily News, and that's about the time the original was published, to considerable acclaim.
And the original was?
Novel number 3, that's right. And it's actually set in an area around here. The editor of the publisher, one of the editors who worked for him, described it as a masterpiece, which was pretty flattering, and it thrilled me to daylights. One thing that they did do, they sold the paperback rights to Bantam for $30,000, which was a huge sum at the time. But I was in such euphoria that I thought, well, this is the beginning of a splendid career. and of course, it doesn't work that way.
Tell the story about how you and Dorothea walked down Fifth Avenue and you saw it displayed in Scribner's bookstore, the feeling that came over you.
Well, of course, we were big Fitzgerald fans in those days, Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and I knew the Fitzgerald connections, F. Scott Fitzgerald connection with Scribner's, which had been his publisher, and they had a store on Fifth Avenue, not too far from 42nd Street. And Dorothy and I were walking around, and let's go in and see if it's in there. And we went in, and I was asking some guy about it. And he says, "Yeah, we have it here." He said, "Would you like me to put it in the window?" And I said, "Would I?" Oh boy! and there it was. The other story I think you get a kick out of was the day after I found out they were going to publish the book, this Herder and Herder Company. I went into work, and I went to a delicatessen, and I bought the biggest brown, fresh, red apple that I could find, and I ate the whole thing.
That was your celebratory.
The Big Apple, right?
The Big Apple, yeah. You worked mainly either the night or the late afternoon shift at the papers as late editor, night editor. This was for the Daily News and the Times both?
Yes, yeah, that's right. They were evening sessions, morning newspapers, both of them. So that gave me the chance to, I'd get home at midnight or 1, 2 a.m. and sleep 6-8 hours, and then get up, and I'd have a couple of hours for my own work. Mm-hmm. And I did that all along. As I think I mentioned to you, I wrote a 1,000-page novel while I was at the Daily News, and it never went anyplace.
And the copy editor's job is to take the raw material coming in from the reporter, edit it for publication?
Yes, that's a good assessment. It's a lot of people think it just has to do with spelling and commas, but there's way more to it than that, because very often the copy editor knows way more than the reporter, and saves the reporter from making egregious mistakes.
Okay.
And then, of course, you also write the headlines. And the Daily News was famous for its headlines.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, the original came out in 1972. And you were at the New York Daily News for how many years?
I think it was a 7.
And then followed that up, you went to the New York Times.
Yeah, I went to the Times in August of '79, I believe it was.
And you were there for?
2 years.
2 years, okay.
And that was absolute euphoria at the beginning. It was like finding out I was going to make it in Michigan. You know, when I passed that first semester, it wasn't a great point average, but it meant I was in and I was going to stay. And the Times was the same way. It was the apex of the profession. And to get hired there, you'd have to take a vacation a week from wherever you were and go work for a week at the Times, just like anybody. And it was very tough to pass their standards. So getting hired by the Times was a huge thing in my life. And I remember I was in a state of euphoria for like 6 months. I was just so happy to be there, to know I was at the top. I came home here and Mr. Rattigan said, "That's something I would like to have done." And I knew
And he was at the top of his profession, his game in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Now, did you seek the jobs out or did they come to you? Did they seek you out?
Those jobs I applied for myself. And then when I went to Parade, the editor of Parade sought me out.
That's because you had a previous working relationship with him.
Yes, we'd had a brief working relationship, and he had read the original and thought very highly of it.
Now, Norman Mailer was listed as a contributing writer for Parade magazine, and because of that, he read the original.
Yes.
And his assessment of the original, from what I read, he called it fine and decent, which coming from Norman Mailer is about as high as praise as you can get, because he was one tough cookie.
He was picky and he was tough. I got annoyed with him later because I kept trying to get blurbs out of him for my military books and he wouldn't give me one.
Give us a little bit about what it was like to meet Norman Mailer, his greeting.
We'd have different kinds of parties or events that he would attend, sometimes with his wife, sometimes without her, but he and I kind of hit it off, and he had this way of reaching out and taking your hand and then leaning forward and bumping foreheads, which was some kind of sort of a primeval greeting of some kind of
like
one author to another kind of thing.
Sort of aboriginal.
Good, yes.
So you then settled in at Parade as managing editor, and Walter Anderson, the editor, was your boss.
Yes.
And before that, he had been under you, and now he was a little bit over you.
Very much over me.
So a little bit reversal there. Then you became interested in Latin American affairs, and you actually interviewed the president of Mexico, Carlos Salinas, and the president of Nicaragua, Violeta Chamorro.
Yeah, I was. My main function as the managing editor of the magazine was to run the magazine, hire and fire, and go and work and see that, help write headlines and things of this nature. While Walter was the number one guy, and his job, well, he was obviously looked over everything, but he'd go out with these people and come up with a good big story assignment. So, so most of that was my job for the most part. But from time to time, some kind of opportunity like this would come up, and he'd say, "You do this," and I'd say, "Okay, great." And Nicaragua and Mexico were both fascinating, and these. And Violeta Chamorro was, I think, a modern-day heroine. Her husband, Pedro, had been killed by the Somoza thugs, and she identified with the Sandinistas for a while, but she found that the Sandinistas were almost as bad as the Somozas in trying to take over all the property. So she split from the Sandinistas and became a representative of the Contras, and somehow these people who go around and try to assure fair elections, persuaded the Sandinista leader, I can't think of his name now, to have a fair election. And to everybody's consternation, Violeta won.
She became rather a role model in her time.
Oh, she did. Yeah, I mean, she was a global figure, and I went down there with Eddie Adams, our great photographer, and we spent a few days with her, and it was a terrific experience. And we had something similar happen, sometime later when I went to see Carlos Salinas of Mexico, and Salinas was they were like a storybook family. He had this beautiful wife and these 3 little kids, and you could see they were emulating the Kennedys, JFK and Jackie, who were long gone. But then it turned out Somoza was just a skunk. Those things were interesting, and at the same time, I mentioned to you earlier the parade headed police officer of the year story it would do every year, and by the International Chiefs of Police. And I would go to the convention, and we'd do a newspaper article, a story in the magazine on this officer of the year, and then I would call the guy up and interview him, and then go to the event, and we'd have and they had this huge auditorium where they had all these cops, and I would get up in front of all these guys and give this talk about who this officer was and what he'd accomplished, and it was very effective, and it was extremely well received. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I think it was kind of in the part of the background that kind of inspired me to handle the Medal of Honor book assignment when that came around.
I know when the Parade magazine came out here in Charlevoix, the buzz went around. Did you see Larry Smith's article in Parade magazine? And that was pretty much the talk of the week, to see your name in print.
Yeah.
So the heroism of the police anywhere in America that you highlighted then that went on to an interest in the broader spectrum of the military.
Well, as I mentioned, from time to time, Walter would just give me one of these assignments. I did one on the 200th anniversary of West Point, and I did one on the library in Washington, D.C., and we were trying to come up with an idea for 4th of July, and Walter said, let's interview some Medal of Honor guys and see what they have to say about whether it's more than just hot dogs and beer on the 4th, and he said, you do it. So I got there was a Medal of Honor Society that I contacted, and I got some names and phone numbers, and I spoke to I think a half a dozen of these medal recipients, some from World War II and some from Vietnam. And I talked to 6 of these guys. And as I mentioned, it was all on the phone. They were extraordinarily candid about what they'd gone through in these combat experiences. And I was just shocked that they were being so open with me.
Which with a lot of veterans was not the case. They didn't want to talk
about it. No, they never want to talk about that stuff. But I couldn't. I was an old reporter, and here I'm getting really good stuff, so I'm not going to stop. I kept talking and typing as I spoke to them, and this much went in the magazine, and there was this much material, and a number of people said to me, "This should be a book," and I kind of, obviously the thought occurred to me as well, and just by coincidence, that was December of 2000. I retired. So on January 1st, I was at Liberty, and I called this guy back at the Medal of Honor Society, and I said, I'd like to do a book on you guys. And he said, well, what's in it for us? And I said, well, if you help me, get the guys, I said, I'll give you a piece of the advance. And as it turned out, as I mentioned to you earlier, I gave them $10,000, which was a lot of money and more than I needed to give them, but I liked them all, and I really wanted this thing to turn out well. And it took several months, but finally in August of 2001, just before 9/11, this agent friend of mine secured this contract with W.W. Norton.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I mentioned it was for like 60 grand, but they give it to you in 3 pieces. But I was able to get the money for the Medal of Honor guys to make them happy. And then I started going around talking to them. And I wanted people from all 3 wars, meaning we weren't in Iraq yet, so it was, a World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And I ended up with, I think, 6 from World War II, 7 from Korea, and 11 from Vietnam, something like that. And I went all over the country finding these guys. And I wanted enlisted men, and not just officers. I wanted the European theater, all these different little things. I wanted to balance it all out. And I would go visit with one of these guys. I went all over the country, and I had an old-fashioned tape recorder with the cassette. And I'd sit down and spend a couple hours or more getting them to talk. And I think, if I may say so, I think this is one place where I really excelled in getting these guys to talk. Because the hardest thing always is to be able to get your subject to trust his interviewer, as you know. It's kind of ironic for me to be here doing this because I should be in your chair.
That's true.
But
I would tell you things you'd never heard of before.
I dare say. And but anyway, I would fly back home with these tapes. Obviously, I try to do a couple, 2 or 3 interviews at a time in different places because I went all over the country. And I would sit down, as I mentioned, I had one of those dictaphone foot pedals, and I had the earphones, and the nice, and I had my computer. And the nice thing about the foot pedal was, as soon as you lifted up your foot, it would stop, so you could catch up with the sentence. And so it was a very efficient means of transcribing these tapes. And once I got it all transcribed, and I left myself out of it for the most part, but once I had it transcribed into the computer, then I would turn around and take all that transcription and turn it into a first-person narrative, so that it would be like something you might encounter talking with someone on a long bus ride, or somebody you'd meet in a bar who would tell you his story. Except these guys were not schooled in this kind of narrative at all. Everything that came resulted from my questions, but I just forgot all that and took all the material and had it phrased it in the first person, and it was very effective, and it worked. And I would work slowly into the interview with where they came from, especially if they were farmers, which a lot of them were. I could talk farm talk without any problem. And so that's how I got all these interviews. And when I started, I still wasn't sure how this was going to come down, how it was going to work out. But and as I mentioned to Dorothea, and I think to you, I hearkened back to my Police Officer of the Year stories, and instead of doing a third-person story like I did with the Cop of the Year, I would do first-person narratives with these guys, and it worked out very, very well.
Well, I know when I read Beyond Glory, each chapter was like a mystery, even though you knew the person was alive. Once you got into it, like a page, you couldn't stop until you got to the last page. How does this turn out the way it does? And each story is completely different.
That's very perceptive and flattering, and I'm delighted to hear you say that, because that's exactly what I was trying to do. And I also, and I know we're about to start talking about Stephen Lang and the play Beyond Glory, and he and I were on a Sunday morning basketball team.
Tell the viewer who Stephen Lang is.
Stephen Lang was an actor on both stage and films, and he'd done some military films. He was, I think he played Pickett in the movie Gettysburg, and he was Stonewall Jackson in Gods and Generals, a failed movie. But on Broadway, he'd been in Death of a Salesman with
Dustin Hoffman?
Yes, Dustin Hoffman and John Malkovich. He was the other brother. And he also created the part of Colonel Jessup in the play A Few Good Men, which, Jack Nicholson made famous. That was Lang's creation to start with. So he was, he was sort of well known, but not really,
Well, you told me that when you played basketball with him, you had your Sunday morning pickup games in Westchester. You were playing with this guy. You had absolutely no idea who he was.
Right. And I mean, somebody might have said he was an actor, but nobody cared. It was one of those games where you just played to play, and it didn't matter where you came from. And I had a lawyer friend. I'd gotten into the thing. He'd offered to get me a book signing in Chappaqua, where the Clintons lived. He said to me at basketball one day, if I'm going to do this, I guess I better see the book. So can you bring it? I said, I'll bring a copy next week. So I brought it in, and this actor, Lang, was sitting a few feet away from me, and he wanted to know what it was, and he wanted to look at it, and he wanted to take it. And I said, well, this is for Ralph, I said, but I'll get you one. And he took this thing home, and it just knocked him out immediately. And he took one of the characters and did a little performance for his wife, who shed tears as he read this to her. And then so he came after me about collaborating on one fashion or another, and without dragging this out, he ended up. He thought at first we'd get different actors to come through town and read different parts, and he was the artistic director of the Actors Studio at the time, and he had some people come in there and read, and he didn't like what they did. And his sister, who was a director in Washington, D.C., Jane, she said, why don't you do it? And so he ended up taking 8 different chapters, 8 different guys, and cutting each chapter down to a 10-minute segment, and then figuring out I don't know what the word would be, continuity, I guess, from one to the next. And so what he would do then was he'd come out, he'd be on a proscenium type stage, jutting out like this with a foot locker, and then he would portray these 8 different guys. One of them had been in the Navy in Pearl Harbor, and 2 of them were black. Daniel Inouye was Asian, and they were all different walks of life, all of them. And he would just you've seen it, you know what it is.
Yeah, I've seen the movie.
He'd put a shirt on and turn, and he'd be the next character.
It was amazing how just by turning around, he could be another character.
Yeah,
and
his
lose
body
and
would
go
change.
right into the other.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. And the thing ran to begin with in the Women's War Memorial down in Washington, D.C., I think around 2004.
That was where the premiere was?
Yes.
It was the theater at Arlington?
Yes, that's right. And it's part of a building called the Women's War Memorial, right next to Arlington Cemetery. And he was there for several months, sometimes very sparsely very sparsely attended. But then the National Endowment for the Arts had gotten in some trouble because being partly sponsoring a Mapplethorpe exhibit. The photographer was kind of racy pictures. Right. And they were trying to improve their image. And this play was perfect because it was patriotic without being falsely patriotic. And there was no spectrum in terms of liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. It was just a story about Americans, going to battle for their country. And people loved it. Well, the National Endowment for the Arts sent him all over the world with this play.
With a lot of stops at American military bases?
Yes,
and on
primarily
ships?
Military bases.
Yes. So it went through regional theaters. It went to Steppenwolf, I believe, in Chicago?
The Goodman.
Goodman Theater.
Yeah.
Right. And then it did the tour of the military. And then it sort of lay fallow for a little bit. And then New York. Yes.
It was the Laura Pell's Theater, part of the Roundabout complex.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to do a play by some Irish playwright, but they had trouble getting the cast. And they had a 2.5-month opening. And they asked Stephen if he wanted to fill it. And he came to New York, and 2 blocks from Broadway, and this thing ran for 3 months with standing O's and sold out every performance. And about halfway through the run, there was the Wall Street Journal loved this thing. They gave it these rave reviews, and he was wearing one of these strap T-shirts, and he was really trained to keep him look good, look the part in these things. And there was a shot of him in a review going like this with his arm raised, and this casting director saw it and got a hold of him, and they flew him to, the show ran 6 nights a week, and the 7th night they flew him to California. He met James Cameron, did a screen test, and got the part of the bad guy colonel in the movie Avatar. Mm-hmm. So he went from being a kind of a journeyman actor to this big star overnight.
Yeah, with the biggest grossing movie of all time
yeah,
at the time.
Yeah. Colonel Quaritch, his name.
Right.
He's a real bad guy.
Oh, he was sort of one-dimensional, but boy, did you hate him.
Right.
You love to hate him.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess, from what I understand, Cameron is planning 2 or even 3 sequels.
Yes.
And Lang says he's supposed to be in all of them.
Right.
So I don't know. They must go farther into the past.
Well, then it was made into a film, and the premiere was in 2015 in the town of Leland, down by Traverse City.
Yes.
And there you are on the poster. It's right down at the bottom line. And you can see the executive producer, one of the 2 is James Cameron, who came in to help support the film of Beyond Glory. So I and 3 friends, myself and 3 friends, drove down to see you for the premiere, and I had no idea what to expect. And Lang was there, got my picture taken with him, and there he was up on the screen. It was like one of those glass balls in a ballroom. When it turned, there was a different light coming out. All these characters that he portrayed, and his portrayal of Daniel Inouye and that missing arm brought me to tears. Yeah. And I think the audience sat there in complete silence when it was over with. It was one of the most moving things I've ever seen.
Very effective theater work, for sure. Yeah.
So now that we have had the tremendous success of Beyond Glory, there were 2 more books that came out. Yeah. The second one, I believe, was The Few and the Proud, and that is about the Marine drill instructors at Parris Island.
Yes. Well, it's also, to some extent, California. The Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, where they send recruits from the roughly west side of the Mississippi. Some from Michigan and Wisconsin go out there. I know my brother did, but most of them were interviews with people who had been to Parris Island. And the interesting thing about this book, if I may say so, was I started with the Montford Point Marines, because the Army was discriminating against, the military was discriminating against blacks, but the blacks at the same time were agitating for participation in the war, and the Marines to comply as much with this as they could, created this whole black division called the Montford Point Marines, and the David Dinkins, the mayor of New York, was there, and the book, and of course it goes on to talk about women Marines and how they got there. And like, for example, when the women were first going through boot camp, they took courses in how to apply makeup. And I was shocked when I heard that. And I thought, God, how could they be so backward? But then it turned out a lot of these recruits come from little tiny obscure places all over the country, and they know nothing about cosmetics or how to take care of themselves or anything. So it wasn't as bad as it sounded, although they haven't done it for a long time. But they didn't allow them to fire the rifle until 1979. So all these changes have emerged over the course of the years. So the book reads like a history of the Marine Corps.
Like a social history.
Yeah, a social history, and it continues to sell quite well.
Good. And book number 3 is titled?
That book is, the drill instructors that I encountered while I was doing this book, some of them had at least one of them had been on Iwo Jima. And he had some Iwo Jima comrades who would show up for these annual drill instructor events in Paris Island. And I'd go down there and I'd meet these guys, and I thought, man, this is made to order for a book, because these guys are all nearing death, and here they were. And so starting with that guy, his name was Mike Mervosh. He became a sergeant major, and when he retired, he was in charge of the whole Pacific Fleet. And the Marines still make a big deal out of him wherever he shows up. I usually would go to these annual drill instructor reunions at Paris Island every April. But through him, I started doing this research, and I got this wonderful material from these guys. What are they called? The code talkers. We have a Navajo code talker, and the CBs, the guys who did all the unloading, and of course there's that huge thing, brouhaha, about who raised the flag on Suribachi.
It's still ongoing.
They dredge it up again and again.
Yeah.
And there was also a couple of Medal of Honor winners there. One, a guy named Woody Williams, I think, I forget if he was a machine gunner or a medic. But anyway, it was a great battle, and it's a terrific. I felt really fortunate that I had that opportunity to do that.
Now, all 3 of the books you've done on the military have been major selections of the Military Book Club, Military History Book Club.
Yes.
Yes. And I believe Beyond Glory reached at least number 35 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yes, at least that. It might have crept up a little bit higher, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Okay. So you've done amazingly well for a kid that came off of a farm in Charlevoix without having any idea what he was going to do with his life, but the pieces, just like a tumbler in a lock, they all sort of fell into place in retrospect.
Rosebud. Yeah.
What is your rosebud?
It goes back to that 1935 Ford truck driving down the hayfields outside of town with a 9-year-old kid sitting in there trying to drive the damn thing without stalling it.
Under fear of severe punishment, yeah. Just a couple of more things, Larry. You have interviewed at least one U.S. president, and that was?
That was the first Bush.
G.W.
G.W. Bush, yeah, and it had something to do with a national fitness program, but as I mentioned earlier, Mike O'Shea, our fitness editor, was with me on this, and we walked into the Oval Office, and Bush was sitting there where you're sitting, and he had a tabloid newspaper on the corner of his desk, and the headline was something like George Bush mates with alien, or some goofy thing that was utterly implausible.
That sounds like the old news of the world.
It was like that, but he was very personable and easy to talk to. Of course, most of them are. That's their job.
Mm-hmm. Any other noted people that you've interviewed for Parade?
Oh gosh, I had a funny story. When they wanted me to do this, the Library of Congress was trying to go digital, and they wanted an article in Parade, and I got sent down there to do this, and we're walking through the stacks, and the guy who was leading me pulled out this letter from Teddy Roosevelt. And as many people know, Roosevelt's first wife died, and he wrote this despairing letter about how his life was over and nothing good could possibly come of it now. And it was the saddest, most poignant thing you ever saw. And this is before Roosevelt had even begun to live. And I said I was lusting after this immediately. And I said to my guide, I said, is this going to be in that archive? And he says, no. I said, but you can put it there, right? He says, yes. I said, all right, put it in there, because it's going in the article. So, and it wasn't really my job to do that sort of thing, but just the ones I've talked about were more or less what happened. One thing I was delighted about Parade was that after 5 years, you qualified for 4 weeks vacation. And in May of 1988, I took those 4 weeks and climbed Mount McKinley in Alaska. And it was an amazing experience, but also a great learning experience, because when I got back, all these things that had gone wrong had all been placed on my desk. Right. And so that was a great lesson for me. And although I was always happy I did it, I had known I never would have done it.
Well, just a couple more things before we wrap this up. Not only are you a mountain climber, but you have participated in the New York Marathon.
4 times.
4 times.
Yeah. Well, that all started here in Charlevoix with Stu Coleman.
With the track team.
And I had no talent athletically to speak of. My brother was a pretty good athlete, but I had very little talent. And the best place for a person with no talent was the mile, because if you just worked like mad, you could become moderately competent. And so that's where I fetched up running the mile. And Stu Coleman and I got to be good friends through that.
Good.
That started everything.
Well, to wrap this up, you actually held one of the most prestigious positions in American journalism, and that is you held I don't know what the exact title was, but you were head of the Overseas Press Club for 2 years. Is that right?
Yes, I was president of the Overseas Press Club of America is the full title.
Okay.
And it is a prestigious organization, and they do a lot for journalists who are in jail, have been detained, and they do an annual awards event, dinner, in Midtown Manhattan. And at the time I was president, the club had kind of fallen on hard times. The membership was down, and there wasn't a lot of money. And it was very fortunate that my boss didn't mind how much money we spent to help the club. So we produced a magazine, we produced a newsletter, we did a whole lot in connection with that dinner. And and as I said later, I said it was the hardest 2 years of my life.
You told me that.
Because it was like having 2 full-time jobs. And it was an experience, and I was very happy when it ended.
But you sort of brought them back up to
yes,
a functioning level.
we turned the corner with them, and got some good guys coming after that. This is a kind of a funny story. The lady who was the club manager had been there for like 20, 30 years, and she kept things to herself, and and we didn't really know what all was happening half the time because she wasn't revealing it, and it was time for her to retire. And the guy who was going to follow me was a very brusque individual named Bill Holstein, who was a major writer, and I think he was the foreign editor of Newsweek and or Business Week, and he was supposed to follow me. And there's some question about whether I would go for a second 2-year term, which I really didn't want to do. And Mary said to me, she said, "Mr. Smith," she said, "if you stay on for 2 more years, I'll stay." She says, but if that Holstein becomes president, I'm going to retire. And I said, oh, gee, that's too bad. We were so glad to get her out of there. Oh, my God.
Well, one last thing before we wrap this up. This is a story I often tell about you when we are talking about Larry Smith. And you and I were having lunch. I can't remember if it was here in Charlevoix or I was in New York. And we were talking about how our lives had progressed up to that particular point. I think we were in our 40s. And you were beginning to lament how much faster time was going now, that you realized you wanted so much more to do. It had gone so fast, but now it's even going faster. And you paused and you looked at me, and in all seriousness, you said to me, David, if I did not have this ability to work with words, I don't know what I would have done with my life, because I don't know how to do anything else. And I don't know if it was the wine we were drinking or if this was just an honesty, a modest honesty coming out of you. But look what you have done. If you were only capable of doing one thing, you ran with that, and look what you produced. You went to the top of your profession. You wrote 3 best-selling books. I mean, what more can a person ask for in a life and a career?
Oh, it's lovely of you to say that, David, and I really appreciate it. One of the things people have said to me when talking about how to success in life, or how to what matters most, and I like to say that there are 3 keys to success in business, which could very well apply to life. And then the first one is hard work. Second one is persistence. You never, ever, ever give up, as Churchill would say. And the third one is the willingness to take an occasional risk. Those are my 3 keys. Mm-hmm. And it's been a fortunate life, and it's especially rewarding and gratifying to be able to have this conversation with you here today and to be part of this project.
Well, thank you for driving all the way to Rhode Island just to do this, like we like to think, but you are back here visiting family also. So, Larry, it's been a pleasure. It always is, and we hope we can do it again sometime.
Shake my hand, David. Thank you.